Now let's take a look at standard cost and variances in Chapter 8. Standards are discussed on page 343, so let's take a look at a short definition of standards as they relate to the accounting process. Standards are predetermined estimates of prices and quantities of inputs to production. And you know what the three inputs to production are. The three inputs to work in process are direct materials used, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So we have standards for each of those three inputs to work in process. Let's first of all take a look at the example in Chapter 8. And the example in Chapter 8 on page 343, the Colonial Pewter Company makes only one product, an 18th century pewter bookend. So let's take a look at the material standards for that product. On page 344, the material standards for the pewter bookends are 3 pounds per unit, 3 pounds of pewter at $4 a pound. And now let's take a look at our structure for analyzing variances. This is going to be our largest structure to date, fairly large. So let's start out with our material standards. First of all, the standard quantity, which I'm going to abbreviate SQ in my formula. And then we have a standard price, which I'm going to abbreviate SP. And then we have total standard quantity, TSQ, the abbreviation in my formula, and total standard cost. And since that's not in my formula, I won't have an abbreviation for that. Actual production, and that's not in my formula, so I will not have an abbreviation for that. We have actual price. In my formula, I will abbreviate that AP. We have total actual quantity, total actual cost, and the total actual quantity I need an abbreviation for, TAQ. There we go. So that's the basic structure for materials. Now let me drop in some numbers. You know what the standard price is. The standard price is $4 per pound. That doesn't go there. It goes right down there. And the standard quantity is 3 pounds per unit. Let me put a decimal in that. And there are my standards, predetermined estimates for prices and quantities of inputs to production. This particular input is materials. So let's take a look at the actual data for June. Colonial Pewter's records for June showed that 6,500 pounds of pewter were purchased at a cost of $3.80 per pound. And during that month, 2,000 pairs of bookends were produced. So 3 pieces of actual data. Let's drop those into our structure here. The actual price is $3.80 per pound. The total actual quantity is 6,500 pounds. And the actual production is 2,000 units, or in this case 2,000 pairs of pewter bookends. And that's all of our given information. So let me mark our given information. There's the standard quantity. There's the standard price, actual production, actual price, and total actual quantity. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of given information. And now let's compute the remaining information in the structure. The total standard quantity tells us how many pounds we should have used to produce those 2,000 pairs of bookends. So I'm going to say 2,000 pairs produced times our standard, say, 3 pounds per pair, or 3 pounds per unit. And that gives us 6,000 pounds. How much we should have used to produce those 2,000 pairs of bookends. Total standard cost, let's compute that. We expected to pay $4 per pound, right there, and we should have used 6,000 pounds. So we should have spent $24,000 for materials to produce those 2,000 pairs of bookends. And the last piece of information in our structure is total actual cost. We actually purchased and used 6,500 pounds, and we actually paid $3.80 per pound for those. So total actual quantity times actual price gives us $24,700. Now let's make some comparisons. First of all, let's compare the total standard price and the total actual price. Notice we paid less per pound than we expected to. In general, not always, but in general, that's a good thing. And let's also compare total standard quantity to total actual quantity. Those two things. Notice our standards say that we should have used 6,000 pounds, and we actually used 6,500 pounds. So we used more than our standards say we should have used. That may be due to waste, inefficiency, or a host of other factors. And that does not look like a good thing to use more to make these 2,000 pairs of bookends than we should have used. And the last thing to compare is total standard cost and total actual cost. Let's take a look at those. And what do you think? Are we over budget or under budget? Looking at those two. Looks like we are $700 over budget. We spent more than our standards say we should have spent. Now let me get this actual information out of the way. And let's take a look at some comparisons. Let's first of all compute the materials price variance. And the formula for the materials price variance looks like this. It arises because of a difference between standard price and actual price. And we've already looked at that difference when we compared the $4 per pound to the $3.80 per pound. That's where we saved 20 cents per pound. And let's multiply that 20 cents per pound savings times the total actual quantity. So there's the formula for the materials price variance. Why don't you pause the video and see if you can't compute the materials price variance. Okay, let's take a look together. Standard price minus actual price. There's the standard price of $4 per pound minus the actual price of $3.80 per pound times total actual quantity, right there, of 6,500 pounds. So we saved 20 cents per pound times 6,500 pounds. That gives us a $1,300 materials price variance. Now, if you had to attach a word to this variance, right out there, right next to it, just to the right of it, would you attach favorable or unfavorable? Which word do you think is appropriate? Since we saved 20 cents a pound, and since generally cost savings is a good thing, I'm going to say that is a favorable materials price variance. Now let's take a look at the materials quantity variance. And the formula for the materials quantity variance says total standard quantity minus total actual quantity. And we multiply that times the standard price. So this part of that formula, the total standard quantity minus total actual quantity, is a comparison that you've already looked at. It's the difference between that 6,000 pounds that we should have used and the 6,500 pounds that we actually did use. So that's an extra 500 pounds that we used over and above our standards, and we multiply that times the standard price of $4 per pound to get the total materials quantity variance. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can't compute the materials quantity variance. Now, since variances should not have signs on them, I'm going to use the absolute value function to get rid of the sign. And if I say total standard quantity of 6,000 pounds minus total actual quantity of 6,500 pounds, that's obviously going to be a negative number. I don't want a sign on a variance. I don't want a negative sign on a variance, so I put the absolute value function in there to get rid of that. And I multiply that extra 500 pounds that we used times the standard price of $4 per pound. And there is a $2,000 materials quantity variance. Now, if you had to attach a word to that, would you attach the word favorable or unfavorable? Correct. That's an unfavorable variance, not because it's positive or negative in the computation, but it is an unfavorable variance because we used more materials than our standards say we should have used. Now, if you put these two variances together, and once again, I don't want a sign here, so I use the absolute value function, and I subtract these two. And there's a $700 variance, and since the unfavorable variance is the larger, I'm going to call this an unfavorable total materials variance. And you've seen that number before when you compared the total standard cost of 24,000 pounds, or $24,000, to the total actual cost of $24,700, you said that we were $700 over budget. And when we put these two variances together, they add up to the over budget amount. So the total materials variance, the combination of these two component variances, is $700 unfavorable. Now let's take a look at the book's computation of these variances. On page 349, for the quantity variance, the actual amount of pewter used was 6,500 pounds. However, the standard amount of pewter allowed for the actual output is only 6,000 pounds, our standard quantity. Therefore, too much pewter was used to produce the actual output by a total of 500 pounds. So there's the excess usage right there, and we multiply that excess usage by the standard price of $4 per pound, and that gives us a quantity variance of $2,000, which of course is unfavorable because we used more than we should have. So 500 pounds at $4 a pound, $2,000. Now let's get rid of that. And take a look in your book at the material price variance. So the price variance, if I can find my cursor here, we actually paid $3.80 per pound, which was 20 cents less than the $4 standard price per pound. So we took that 20 cents that we saved and multiplied times the 6,500 pounds that we actually purchased and used, and that gave us a materials price variance of $1,300. And that's favorable because it is a cost savings. Now, why don't you pause the video and see if you can't work exercise 8-4. So exercise 8-4 asks you to, in requirement 2, compute the materials quantity and price variances. And requirement 1 says what cost for wood should have been incurred. What cost should have been incurred? That's the total standard cost to make the 4,000 chopping blocks. How much greater or less was this than the cost that actually was incurred? So for requirement 1, they ask you to compare total standard cost with total actual cost. How much cost should have been incurred and how much cost was actually incurred. And then to break that down into the two component variances. So in the example from the book, the difference was $700, and the two component variances added up to that $700 difference. So pause the video in just a second and see if you can't work exercise 8-4. Okay, let's take a look together. First of all, let me go up and copy my structure, because like everything we do in this class, the structure is the key. Copy and paste. Let me delete all of the information from the example in the text, including the favorable or unfavorable designations, since they may change. And now let me go back and get the information from the exercise. Exercise 8-4. Scoot that up as far as I can. Get rid of that little red box. And let's do my standards first. So the company manufactures chopping boards, and the standards for one chopping board are 2.5 board feet of hardwood at a cost of $1.80 per board foot. So let me drop in my standard quantity, which is 2.5 board feet per chopping block. I'll just say per unit to be generic. And the standard price is $1.80 per board foot. Now let's take a look at actual. Starting right there. During a recent month, the company manufactured 4,000 chopping boards. Let me drop that in right here. 4,000 units using 11,000 board feet. That is the total actual quantity. And this hardwood cost the company $18,700. Total actual cost, $18,700. So the information given, the given information is a little different from the example in the book. We still have 5 pieces of given information, but instead of being given those 2 and having to find total actual cost, we are given those 2 and we have to find the actual price. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can't compute the actual price at this point. And let me indicate the given information in blue, those 2 items. So compute the actual price. Did you say $18,700 divided by 11,000 board feet, and you got $1.70 per board foot? So let's compare $1.80 per board foot and $1.70 per board foot. That's our standard price and our actual price. And looking at those, we can see that the materials price variance is going to be favorable. We spent 10 cents less per board foot than we expected to. Now let's go ahead and compute our total standard quantity. We made 4,000 chopping blocks times, we should have used 2.5 board feet per chopping block. So we should have used 10,000 board feet, and now we can compare those two things. Our standards say we should have used 10,000 board feet, and we actually used 11,000 board feet, so we used more than our standards say we should have used, so the material's quantity variance is going to be unfavorable. Now let's compute total standard cost right there. We should have used 10,000 board feet, and we expected to pay $1.80 per board foot. So multiplying those two together gives me a total standard cost of $18,000. And now I can compare my third comparison. I can compare those two things. We should have spent $18,000 in materials to manufacture these 4,000 chopping boards, and we actually spent $18,700. So we spent $700 more than we should have. And I believe that answers requirement 1. So requirement 1 says what cost should have been incurred. Well, that cost right there, the total standard cost. How much greater or less was this than the cost incurred? Let me go down here and let me subtract those two things. And there's the answer to the second part of requirement 1. And I'm just going to label this over budget because we are $700 over budget. So requirement 1 says what cost should have been incurred, $18,000. How much greater or less was this than the actual cost incurred? Well, it was $700 less than the actual cost incurred. Now let's take a look at the variances. So the materials price variance says standard price minus actual price. We've already looked at that 10-cent difference times 11,000 board feet. So that's 1,100, and that is a favorable materials price variance of $1,100. And the materials quantity variance arises because we use more or less materials, in this case board feet of lumber, than we should have. And we've already made that comparison. We compared 10,000 to 11,000. And we came to the conclusion that we used 1,000 more board feet than we should have, times a standard price of $1.80 per board foot. So right there in the formula is the extra 1,000 board feet that we used. And this part of the formula says multiply by the standard price of $1.80 per board foot. So that is an $1,800 unfavorable materials quantity variance. And when you put those two together, you get that same $700 that we're over budget, and that total materials variance is unfavorable because we spent more for materials than our standard said we should have spent for materials. And that completes exercise 8-4. Be prepared for a quiz over this material at the beginning of class on Monday.